Aquarian Music Witch, the podcast.
That all is probably a good episode, but I could totally keep talking for another hour. So if you're open to it, I'm interested in hearing more about a lot of your thoughts, including like when did you first encounter like anything about critical theory, intersectionality, identity studies? Was that anything you ever saw in undergrad, or was that something you found like later on social media or whatever?
Largely later. Those were things that I was very tangentially kind of exposed to, but definitely there was very little time made for them in any of my undergrad education. There's this tendency in the way that they educate, which I feel is a little backwards, to start from the purported beginning, usually ancient Greece, as the beginning of the Western tradition, and then try and teach everything in chronological order from there. So then you're kind of lucky if you get to any contemporary philosophy. And even if you do, it's, just all crammed into like the 2 weeks before finals. And so I was exposed to some of the terms, but not really given any substantial understanding of their context or what they really meant. And I think probably one of the best examples of that is just with, what's considered sort of the whole realm of feminist philosophy, that I wasn't even really exposed to that as a concept in undergrad. Like, I was taught feminism as a social and political movement that happened, not as not as a philosophy or movement of thought. And
it's like a pretty substantive, substantially contributed to type of thinking. So it's just kind of like pretty striking to me that it's just not a part of a standard philosophy course or like whatever that is.
It was mind-boggling to me when I started really digging into those ideas after I graduated. And like you said, a lot of them was I would be following different social media people that talk about philosophy, yourself being one of them, and I hear someone throw out a philosopher that I never even heard of before and be like, like, I wonder why that one didn't make the cut. And then just really quickly went down this rabbit hole of postmodernism and feminist thought and intersectionality. And I really felt kind of insulted by some of my education there, which, I don't want to be like too harsh on it, because I had some genuinely wonderful professors that taught me a lot of really meaningful stuff that I still appreciate. But so many of the objections that I would be raising in class were just word for word the kind of stuff that I was reading in feminist literature and postmodern theory after I graduated. And I felt kind of insulted that like none of it had been taken seriously, and that none of these things had been raised as like valid philosophical positions when they'd already been established and argued for years, if not decades, depending on the subject.
Do you think that your professors were simply not aware of some of these ideas, or do you think there was like just a personal bias of not taking them seriously, or do you think it was more like a systemic bias of they felt like that their jobs really, or they're in place in their jobs because of that, or maybe all of those things?
I definitely think that there was a blend there. I'm sure that there were people in the philosophy department dealing with those things. At least I certainly hope that there were, but probably as more specialized fields that weren't really considered part of, the broader undergrad curriculum. And I do think that it was somewhat a problem of, most of my professors being educated well before a lot of those ideas. Some of them had not even probably been articulated or written about by the time some of my professors were being educated. And even the younger professors likely, were in a similar program with professors that, grew up only being taught up to modernism. And that was just, you know, the bulk of their education. And so, yeah, I think that things like feminist thought and postmodernism were probably present in areas of the department that I just wasn't exposed to as much, but were very much kind of kept siloed away as more niche specialties rather than integrated into the broader canon of philosophical thought.
Yeah, that completely makes sense to me, because I do think that they probably would even just like when I had professors who taught critical theory, it was always through petty things like, hold on, petty reasons why you don't have access to it unless you really dig or unless the professor really, really tries. And even then, it's like always being sabotaged or something. Like, had even designed a course, and that was one of the kind of primary, or like redesigned basically one of our core graduate courses in order to be more focused on these things. And the next semester just sort of unceremoniously the course was just reassigned to another professor to teach. You know, some kind of bullshit admin thing that just really physically stands in the way of even being able to do something sustainable for the students to have access to this stuff. I don't know how well that reads as an example, because I feel like it's like dumb. It's just like interdepartmental drama, basically, that's just like constantly in the way. But I also was thinking about, you mentioned like you kind of go through philosophy in a chronological order, and by the time and it's similar to like history in school, you know, you get up there to maybe you hit early 20th century and suddenly you're out of time and it's time for the AP exam or whatever. And actually it turns out same thing for music history. Like you go through kind of quote unquote music history and you start way back in the Baroque era or whatever, or perhaps before medieval era, ancient Greek and Roman kind of stuff you might touch on. And then you mosey your way through a timeline in timeline order, and then you hit like maybe the early 20th century. We're fully in the 21st century. Maybe you skip a whole century because you just run out of time, basically. And then you have this kind of false sense that music history is classical music history rather than everything that's happened in the last 100 years or more. Then that by extension just doesn't even get taken seriously. And it's bizarre. And I had some classes that were in pedagogy, which is like like the philosophy of how to teach something. And so that was specific to like music pedagogy. But we talked about, I was lucky to have some really good education, and we talked about pedagogy of history and how, like, what would you do if you were not going to order this in a chronological way? How would you teach a history class? And I would think about, and I know you've mentioned Deleuze and Guattari, so I thought a lot, I was really influenced by their ideas, especially about kind of rhizomal patterns. And they talk about like ways of thinking, but at times I would kind of apply that to ways of teaching, and say, well, what if instead of doing it in a chronological order, we just take these kind of nodal points of thought, like these kind of little ideas that you can grasp onto and have familiarity with as a student, and then you start to make networking kind of connections between those ideas and move outward from there until you have a network that gives you a comprehensive idea of what's happening. I think that's kind of an autistic way of thinking, is a theory I have, but that's certainly how I think. And it's the best. And I always sucked at history, like regular history and music history. I sucked at it. I was terrible at remembering dates and names and eras that things happened in. And, you know, I was terrible at that. And then I realized that it was because of how it was taught. It was just didn't work in my brain. And once I started having these little nodal points, like, oh, but I am really interested in this particular, I'm really interested in this song, Jadot by Ravel. I started to fall asleep every night to this song, and just got it in my brain, and then cared about whatever was going on with that song. And then I started to care about what's going on with Ravel. And then that became an entire dissertation worth of like caring about the whole connection of stuff going around, what's happening with the Russians, what's happening with Orientalism, what's happening with depictions of water in the music, what's happening with, you know, why is there a little epitaph at the beginning of that piece that says the river god laughing at the nymph which tickles him or something? Like, why, what river god? Like, why is there this kind of ancient Greek and Roman kind of connection there? suddenly I have a whole comprehensive idea. That was it was a sidetrack. But anyway, I wonder like how you would apply that to philosophy. Like if you could teach philosophy, would you approach it like that maybe? And do you think it would help fix some of those problems, or is there a different way that you might approach it, or a different way that you might present it to somebody that's kind of like newer on this journey?
Yeah, I it is something that I think about a lot. And, to some degree, there'll probably always be some utility to just having the big survey course where you just cover as much ground as you possibly can to kind of give a student a general idea of what ideas are out there. um, but I would love to see more classes taught in that way of taking, maybe a contemporary idea and then tracing its influences back so that you're starting with something that's relevant to current philosophical discourse.
Yeah.
And just the current era, something that a student might be more likely to actually relate to or find relevant to their lives, and that will also allow them to actually be taking part in like contemporary philosophy. And then in order to speak very articulately on that, they're going to have to learn some of the history. So I think that's a great way to like then start tracing those points of if you start off with an idea like, I mean, intersectionalism is a good example. Then you could trace back different sort of iterations of feminist thought, and then even get back in towards older philosophical conceptions of objectivity and subjectivity, and the role of the thinker and author in interpreting works. And you could branch off in a lot of different directions there, kind of based off, whatever the overarching focus of the course was, or just the interest of the student. And that, I think, is one of the harder things about the rhizomal structure, is that it needs to be very self-directed. I don't think it's as suited to, just lecturing to a hall of like 50 students.
Well, I also
But
definitely find that like when you approach teaching in these alternate ways, you really can't be like, I found much more success in my years of teaching when I approached the class more like a collaborative effort, where the goal, where we're all kind of working together so that we can all kind of learn things, particularly the students and the people paying to be there, but also, I'm learning things all the time. And I found that like I had a much better relationship to my students, a much healthier relationship to my students when I approached it that way, as opposed to, and I never really approached it this way, but even in the beginning, you have more anxiety and you want to be upfront and you want to be the authority and you want to be, kind of in some kind of like, you feel like you have to establish your authority or whatever. And I would see other professors kind of do that, even to the point where too commonly, like a student would ask a very good question and the professor would just revert to kind of just dismissing it, making the student feel lesser or something, and reestablishing authority and moving on. Or even like a student would correct a professor or something and people couldn't always take that because their egos were in the way or whatever. I do feel like I really like that kind of moving backward approach, and maybe tracing a thread, and maybe even like giving students more of a liberty to explore some individual thread. Like maybe the final project or something is, what are some of the earliest influences you can trace back to that you think are most important leading to this, or whatever it is, and kind of give people a chance to not necessarily all learn the same thing and be on their own paths. And then that brings me to kind of a question of like, you mentioned a canon. There's a canon in music theory, of course, and there's a canon of really any. So a canon is kind of a collection of works that's established to be central to, or like centrally important to, understanding a field, I would say. And then it becomes this really interesting question about like, what is part of the canon, what gets to be part of the canon, how do you get into the canon? And like for music, you have kind of Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Handel, Haydn, like these kind of standard, all coincidentally white Viennese or German, and who happen to coincidentally be the most geniuses like nothing out of Africa ever mattered in the canon, whatever. And
Hmm.
just coincidentally and just subjectively, don't worry too much about why. And so suddenly you can dig into that and be like, well, wait, like I remember being very young, and somebody on Facebook who was like into music school with me at some point was just like, the fact that there's no women in the canon really speaks to, I don't even think women can be good composers. Like that seems to be proven to not be possible. Like statistically, because have you ever even heard of a woman composer? Well, at that time, we really weren't taught very many. Now they
Hmm.
will, a lot of schools will make efforts to kind of DEI it and like reintroduce women into the canon, scrounge around for whatever Black composer there's even a historical record of, and kind of add him in or whatever. And Phil Ewell, who's almost going to be my outside reader of my PhD before I flunked out of PhD school. Phil Ewell is a really cool figure in music theory because he was one of the first people who talked about anti-racism in music theory and
Hmm.
music studies, and got kind of viral because there was a weird racist backlash to some of what he said. And it was pretty, like, I would encourage anybody to kind of look into that Phil Ewell and Schenkerian analysis controversy. But regardless, it brought up a lot of questions of like that whole conversation has been happening in the last like 10 years or so in music theory. It's kind of behind other disciplines in terms
Hmm.
of that. And then the questions become like, well, okay, there are a lot of other composers we could be focusing on in the canon, or do we even need a canon? Like, but you have to kind of audition into a school and know certain things about the canon. Like I was absolutely tested on like what is an augmented sixth and what kind of augmented, like some obscure thing about not about music theory, about specifically Viennese 18th century classical music. And then that becomes like some kind of center of what I need to know in order to be an expert on. Well, I promise you, I've taken graduate courses in how to write like Bach. And it doesn't really matter. Like that was probably not like all like that's helpful because now I can just say it's bullshit and I'm officially an authority to tell you so. Like it's just it matters for some people if they want to do certain things in music. It is not central. So then it becomes a broader like philosophical kind of a quandary. Like, what do you do with a canon? How do you then decide how people get into programs and how knowledgeable they are and what does that select for? But can you really throw it out? And then how do you even approach the subject and teaching the subject and knowing what matters? So I wonder, I don't know, like that's a lot to throw out, but I think about that a lot with how do you teach music? I have a pretty alternative approach to that. And I do you think there should be a canon in parallel in philosophy? Like, what do you think about the canon and do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I do. Too many thoughts is the problem.
Me too, obviously.
I, to a certain extent, I think it is kind of inevitable that something's going to organically crop up like that. The most popular thinkers in an age, regardless of that, if that's because of the merit of their work or because of the way they're positioned in society. Spoiler alert, it's usually the latter. Then they're just going to be circulated more. They're going to be talked about more, and that's going to make them more influential on the next generation of thinkers. And
Sure.
in that way, there is definitely a relevance, I think, to what the canon is and to knowing those big thinkers. But I think that it's more, I don't know, I think it should be approached as a matter of deconstruction rather than like retraining. Like it's almost like philosophy courses are designed to train you to think like an Enlightenment philosopher, rather than to help you deconstruct the assumptions that these people were building on that caused them to believe in the claims that they did. Which, whenever you get too deep into any philosophy, you always find that their claims are resting on assumptions that they're making based on what they were taught about the world and about philosophy. So I think it's really valuable to know those things so that you can kind of trace the lineages of ideas in that way and see what influences culturally and intellectually have shaped kind of our modern perception of the world. But I think that also the flip side of that is precisely why addressing a more diverse base of thinkers, I think, is so important, because as long as you are kind of paring things down into this tradition of the most influential European and American thinkers, then it's really quite limiting intellectually. Like, it really limits the tools at your disposal as a thinker, because you only see things from this certain perspective. Even the debates that you're talking about within the canon are all very much debates framed within the same basic assumptions about what is valuable, what is worth talking about. But then as soon as you break out of that and you start learning more about, feminist philosophy, intersectional thinking, just international philosophy, from all kinds of different backgrounds, I think the more diverse of a basis you can form there, the more of a genuinely robust approach to philosophy you can develop, because you're actually seeing all of these different potential angles that you can come at something, rather than trying to interpret everything through the same few lenses all of the time. So I think that, that kind of idea of the philosophical canon is a valuable introduction to philosophy, maybe in your 101 course, and is a worthy area to specialize in if that's something that, you're particularly interested in. If anyone wants to study that, there's nothing wrong with it. There are lots of brilliant ideas in that tradition. But I think, if I was trying to educate myself or anyone else to be the best thinker and philosopher that they could be, I think that would involve trying to not necessarily include, I don't even think we should really be arguing necessarily about who the best, smartest people are. I think it's much more kind of profitable to just explore the most diverse voices that you can, because that will just give you the broadest base of knowledge to work with. And I think that I think that that's when you start to have genuinely creative and interesting ideas and discussions, when you have that kind of broad base. When it's all so narrowly defined within a single tradition, I think it really becomes more about rhetoric than anything. It's who can sound the smartest, who can poke the most holes in the other person's argument, rather than how can we, collaboratively cultivate a discourse that is actually teaching us new things.
Yeah, I think that the argument for having any kind of canon is just that there's like some points of commonality through which we can basically communicate. Like, it's like that thing of where when you're in a totally different ideological structure from someone else, you kind of don't even have a foundation to begin to have communication. So like, I also don't really begrudge the people that, study Bach. Like, if there is a place for that. But I also just think I don't know, I just think it's so centered, and then it does become like as if nothing else exists even. And the funny thing about music too, and I wonder if this is true for philosophy or for your experience, is that again, like, then you go chronologically and then you just end in the early 20th century, and they call it the museumification of music, because in like Bach's time he's writing for church. In Mozart's time he's writing because he has patrons. And then Brahms comes along, and what's he writing for? In order to be as good as Mozart and Bach. Like, he's not writing for like a functional reason anymore. He's writing to get into the canon. And so now you're into this weird postmodern place of the post 20th century where like there's no more space in the canon. Nobody fits anymore. Like, so you literally could be the best composer in the world. If you write something in 2024, you're not in the canon. It's already filled up. It's like there's only so many spaces in heaven or whatever. So that's a weird skew. Is that also true for philosophy, like that nobody talks about big people thinking in the 21st century, or is it a little different?
It's definitely a dynamic. Again, there's certainly, I think most departments would have, contemporary philosophy courses you could take, although I think a lot of those are probably more accessible to graduate students. I don't think they open as many of those sections to undergrads. And I think it's very similar in a lot of ways. And I think it also has a lot to do with how much innovation has happened within the past couple of centuries, that it's really like you can cover, all of like classical philosophy through modernism by only really talking about a handful of philosophers. Not that there aren't many more, but society was changing on a much slower scale then, and as such, I think ideas were changing at a slower rate. But then once you hit like the Industrial Revolution, and then particularly, doubly, triply so as you hit the digital revolution, ideas are being exchanged and innovated and changed at such a staggering rate that people just can't keep up. Like that is a whole field of discipline, a whole field of discipline, a whole field of study to just, you could probably teach a course by the decade now, as opposed to doing, sorting it by century or even by civilization, like we do with a lot of older philosophers. And there's so many differing directions that people are taking their ideas in, that I think it's really hard to know what is important. We don't know what the lasting ideas are going to be yet. We're like right now in the just in the midst of it all, in the midst of all these ideas, kind of fighting it out within the philosophical space, or synthesizing within the philosophical space and changing. And so I think it's really, really hard for people to know what is most important to address when you're just talking about the last couple centuries. I think the closer you get to the modern day, the harder it is to know what the important, influential philosophy is. And personally, I think that's kind of a good thing. Like, I think that that shouldn't be so much of the emphasis anyway. It should be about participating in the discourse rather than trying to have the last word and being the one who is remembered.
Well, yeah, rather than canonizing something. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Do you think that has a direct relationship to postmodernism, though, too, and just like the disillusion of any kind of coherency of anything?
I definitely think that that's created some challenges, but frankly, I don't think postmodernism is as unwieldy of a beast as people make it out to be. I think that it challenges a lot of cherished assumptions that people had prior to a lot of postmodern theory, and that can be very uncomfortable. And when you're kind of habituated to a certain way of thinking, it's a lot harder to adapt to something that was breaking with, I think, a lot of tradition in the way that postmodernism did. But in another way, there's actually not really anything that terribly new in postmodernism. Like I think postmodernism is very similar to a lot of like really ancient ideas about non-dualism and the relationship between words and reality. I think these ideas have kind of circulated through cultures for a really long time, and that it only seems so like novel and challenging because of the cultural place that we're coming out of with modernism. So,
a good point.
I think a lot of postmodernism gets sold really short because it's just very, I don't know, I think it might have the fatal flaw of really relying on the idea of interpretation, which I think is probably historically the weakest part of any discipline. And I wanted to dig into this idea a little bit earlier when you were talking about the way that we teach classes and kind of teaching them more collaboratively.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really great idea, because what practically happens in a lot of courses, especially if you have, a kind of more egoistic professor like that, is that you stop learning how to interpret a work. What you learn how to do is judge how your professor is interpreting the work and try to interpret them as close to them as possible so that you will get a good grade, because they're not really grading you on how good your thoughts are most of the time. It's typically they're grading you on how close your understanding is to what they think. And in a lot of ways, I think that was kind of the dynamic of modernism, of the belief in this objective realm in which there is a correct way to interpret things and an incorrect way. And I think a lot of people struggle with postmodernism because they have that tendency to want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, okay, well, nothing is real and we can't make sense of anything and it's all just nonsense now. And I don't really see a lot of that in postmodernist writing. Certainly some people make more extreme claims, but there's always like a middle path there, right? It's like there clearly are things that we can commonly recognize and communicate about, but they're always shaded by our personal experience and interpretation. They're never going to appear exactly the same to two people. So interpretation is always going to be kind of at the center, I think, of what we're doing in any discipline where we're communicating with each other. That's kind of the foundation of it, is our ability to interpret and creatively engage with each other's articulations of the world. And I think that's something that a lot of philosophers have spent a lot of time trying really hard to reject that, trying really hard to assert that if they just think hard enough, they can come up with the perfect system, the perfect ideological framework that cannot be misinterpreted in any way. And then finally, they'll be able to communicate about absolute truth with people. And I think that that's a lot of the difficulty with postmodernism, is that it's finally shrugging some of that off and saying, okay, well, maybe we're never going to have 100% clarity about anything. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we should stop. And I don't think many people actually believe that have been influential postmodernists. I think that I read it often as a very hopeful philosophy of this kind of absurd standard of objective truth is actually inhibiting our ability to understand each other in a lot of ways. And if we take this task of interpretation seriously, then maybe we can actually come a little closer to understanding each other. Whereas if we have this rigid acceptance or this rigid insistence on being absolutely correct and certain about things, then we're going to keep falling back into this position where just basically whoever is the most rhetorically talented gets to be right, whoever can best sway the reader. And then I think you get what you see in a lot of philosophy, where it just turns into rhetoric. It's just, can I convince my reader that my position is true, rather than can I meaningfully explore an idea in a compelling way that might inspire other people?
Aquarian Music Witch, the podcast, is made possible by listeners like you. To support this project, you can contribute directly through our Ko-fi page at ko-fi.com/aquarianmusicwitch, or consider subscribing to our Supercast page. With the AMW Supercast Content Access Pass, you'll gain access to a vault of exclusive content and other cosmic perks starting at just $5 a month. Now, back to the show.
I really like that reframing, because I don't know how successful I can be at it even in academia, because it's very it's just very ideological. But I do think that there is a real importance that can't be undersold just about like the political negotiation of ideas and how alive they are. I think especially when you're trying to convey ideas as any kind of like philosopher, public intellectual, I think it's I don't know. I do think there's something valuable about the politics of it, if that makes sense. And it's not just like, it's not just like distilled to an idea. And I think that it's important to be able to explore ideas apart from that. But I don't know. I also think that the politics of it is just highly relevant. So yeah, I think that's an interesting journey into like all of the postmodern questions of meaning and identity. And we talked about Nietzsche a little bit too, I think.
Mm,
And I was really, really inspired by Nietzsche myself when I was younger, especially because I remember thinking that like he was the guy that said God is dead, basically, and like
mm,
everything is meaningless. And then kind of what do you do with that? Where do you go from there? And I was asking a lot of those same questions when I was in college. And reading him, I kind of came to think of myself as a positive nihilist. So I was like, well, I guess I believe in that meaninglessness, but I'm going to take it in a way that means, and that's somebody's idea that I forget who it is, but somebody said something like make your life into a work of art. And I took that really
mhm,
seriously and thought, well, I guess you can just kind of paint this canvas of life being some kind of meaningful work of art that you just make, because there is nothing bigger. And that was like a really revelatory idea for me at the time, like, or it was a really freeing idea,
mhm,
that there wasn't like God making you have to feel guilty about a bunch of things or whatever, but there was just like you could do whatever you wanted. So I was like, well, I can, and then you can kind of do stuff for other people that way. And I thought,
mhm,
I guess I'll just, at least, what if I just pretend to have hope, and then that will mean whatever I want it to mean. That will mean things to other people. Maybe I can just convince. And I did this from a place of like pure depression too. So I was really like pulling myself out of a very deep pit in that way, because I had kind of like spiraled to the bottom of something there and was very disillusioned with a lot of things. And then he was somehow like comforting to me to think
mhm.
that, okay, we can just make some meaning, I don't know. But I think you said once that when you're talking to somebody who's not that into philosophy, you say your favorite philosopher is Nietzsche.
Yeah, and that's not a dig against Nietzsche at all. It's because I think he's one of the best philosophers in for getting people engaged in something. I think,
Yeah. It's very colorful. Like his writing is very compelling because it's very rich feeling.
mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
he's very emotional in his writing, and he's a big contrarian, and I think a little bit of a satirist too. I think a lot of what he writes is has more of a satirical edge than people give him credit for. And there are other philosophers that I might agree a little more with their perspectives or have been particularly inspired by. But when it comes to just like starting a meaningful conversation with someone, I don't think I've ever come across someone who does that better than Nietzsche. And a lot of times it's because of how much people disagree with him. Like he does some has some passages where he's very critical of things that most people take for granted as just objectively good, like compassion. Like he'll really rake compassion over the coals as a admirable quality, and say that really it's just self-serving and all these things that typically make people a little uncomfortable to hear, and they want to argue against them. And I think that's just incredibly valuable because not much philosophy, especially not within the kind of the Western canon, which Nietzsche's definitely penetrated into. You typically get a lot of stuff that is kind of people are just nodding along and being like, that's a very interesting thought. I'll have to reflect on that. But when you come out and say that like compassion is a selfish quality, people have opinions. They want to argue about it. They want to think about it. And I think that's really valuable. And so like ultimately, I agree with some of the things that he says, and other things I'm like, I don't really even know if it matters to me whether or not I agree with this, because it's just sparked such good conversations and really taught me a lot about what I think about those subjects in ways that I never would have explored if I hadn't been challenged in that way.
Yeah, I think Nietzsche's great for undergrads to read, honestly.
Yeah.
Um, Definitely. And then I guess we've talked also about like diversity, or you also brought up diversity
Mhm.
earlier. And where did you maybe first encounter your thinking about diversity, or do you have like other scholars that you think about when it comes to that topic?
It's an interesting question because I really don't know if there was a place that I was first exposed to that idea, because I think it was something that I kind of had to pursue for myself before I found the writing that reinforced why that was important. And
did you feel like it was important early on, though, if that makes sense?
yeah, and I think that's where a lot of that motivation came from, is that it was just sort of discourse that I was surrounded by, people arguing, what the role of diversity was in all kinds of places, just generally a cultural discussion that was going on, but then also within academia and within philosophy. And, there's also just like, it's constantly, I feel like, a sort of undertone in academia about diversity, especially in relation to things like affirmative action. That's, everyone loves to have an opinion about that. And I found myself like really intuitively disagreeing with a lot of the anti-diversity rhetoric that I was hearing, that is very much cloaked in very meritocracy kind of language of like, oh, well, we shouldn't be giving anyone a preference based on their identity because it should just be about the value of people's ideas. But then, of course, who's deciding what ideas are valuable and what ideas are not? And there seems to be a really strong theme of the most valuable ideas always coming from powerful white men. And that always felt wrong to me, but I never knew how to argue against it, like, because that's something that, like, on the face of, yeah, I agree that, we should be evaluating the merits of people's positions on things, but clearly something's going wrong in that process. And so it was an issue that I didn't know how to form an opinion on for a long time. I felt intuitively like diversity was a really important aspect of culture in general, and so just as much so in the academy and in philosophy. But I had trouble articulating why that was, I think, until I really started understanding intersectionality and understanding how different my perspective was from people that had different lived experiences, and that I was kind of constrained within my lived experience and would never be able to come up with an idea that originated from outside that, but other people could, because other people had different experiences. So I think the realization of that limitation was when I really started to understand that instinct and why I actually valued and wanted to really seek out more diverse perspectives, because the vast majority of what I'd been exposed to was written by people that had, at least on certain axes, very similar experiences to me. And in that way, I wasn't being challenged and wasn't learning more about the world, was just kind of having, a lot of these ideas that I grew up around reinforced and kind of thoughtlessly often, sort of back to the idea of unfalsifiable claims, that kind of superiority of the masculine European perspective was just an unfalsifiable assumption that sort of undergirded so much of what I was being taught, that it wasn't something I could really recognize until I had some space from it. And when I was in college reading 3 or 4 different philosophers at once, I really didn't have time to be doing a lot of like independent research. And then once I did have that time and started exploring those perspectives, it just really made me realize how weak that part of my education had been, like how small the scope was, how limited my perspective was because of it, and how weak my beliefs and my arguments were because of that it really like insulated me from having to take a really serious look at all of my unchallenged assumptions about the world and about what is good and bad, and and about what knowledge is and what it means to be correct about something. And so I really came to appreciate it from just initially, I think, from a satisfaction of my own curiosity, that I felt like that I'd been kind of stifled in the university in that way. And then once I started reading more diverse philosophers, it just opened up whole new realms of thought for me, and it was absolutely thrilling in that way. And then as I became more exposed to the frameworks of like intersectionality in particular, then that kind of reinforced that belief and gave me more of the framework I needed to understand really what was so valuable about those different perspectives, and how much more diversity there was in the world and in human experience than I'd ever even imagined could be the case, I think, when I was growing up. So, just the more I discover in that way, the more I learn how much there is to know about things, and how small my life experience and my personal perspective is. And I think that no matter what discipline or realm you're in, you just do yourself a massive disservice when you put those kind of cultural blinders on and only look at things from one perspective. That it's just inevitable that you're going to have weaker work in whatever field you want to be pursuing if you don't learn from every source that you can.
I completely agree.